Smoke curled above the frozen river, where canoes once carried trade instead of blood. The snow muffled every sound, but beneath it lay a silence born of fear. Villages had burned before, but never for this long, or this wide. What had begun as scattered ambushes turned into decades of organised conquest. The Beaver Wars, they would later call it, though those who lived through it knew no single cause and never agreed on when it truly began. And as you listen now, maybe you're far from those frozen banks. Perhaps in Montreal, wrapping up your day with a warm drink, or in New York City, watching streetlights blur against the evening snow, or maybe in Calgary, driving home through quiet winter roads. Wherever you are, this forgotten chapter of history reaches you across time. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and if you'd like to keep uncovering the stories history tried to bury, subscribe. It helps more than you know. Now back to the North Woods. The first gunfire had echoed generations earlier, when alliances were fragile and every musket changed the rules. For 92 years the northern forest would know no peace. Tribes would vanish, entire trade networks would collapse, and colonial powers would rise from the ashes of burned longhouses. As night settled over the St. Lawrence Valley, fires flickered between camps that once traded together in peace. The Iroquois Confederacy sharpened their hatchets while the Algonquin prayed to unseen spirits. Somewhere between them, French muskets glinted under a violet sky, their barrels cold and waiting. The great silence before the storm had ended, and with it, the fragile balance that had allowed dozens of nations to survive side by side for generations. Before the fighting began, the land itself told a story of abundance and order. From the Hudson to the Great Lakes, beaver dams glittered beneath the morning mist, turning valleys into wetlands rich with fish, timber, and life. The Huron, Algonquin, Erie, and Iroquois peoples lived within this rhythm, their movements tied to the seasons and the waterways. Trade routes stretched across hundreds of miles, linking villages by canoes, wampum belts, and long-established agreements. Every pelt carried value far beyond its texture or warmth. It was a symbol of status, diplomacy, and spiritual connection. Into this delicate world came the French, paddling upriver from the Atlantic with goods of iron, glass, and gunpowder. The Dutch followed through the Mohawk Valley, dealing in firearms and liquor. What began as exchange soon turned into dependency, and with dependency came rivalry. By the 1620s, the beaver had become currency, a way to gain influence, arm warriors, and buy loyalty. Rivers that once mirrored only the sky now reflected deeper conflict. Villages whispered of raids, shifting alliances, and betrayal. The forests once shared began to fracture. And still, the demand for fur grew. Every successful hunt now brought the shadow of war one step closer. In Haudenosaunee villages, decisions were made slowly, through councils that valued unity above haste. The 5 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, had built a powerful alliance across generations. Their longhouses stretched the length of forests, each one sheltering entire clans beneath a single roof. Beneath the rafters, women chose chiefs, elders kept oral histories, and warriors trained to defend trade routes and hunting grounds. For the Iroquois, the fur trade was both opportunity and risk. With Dutch traders offering muskets in exchange for pelts, the Confederacy recognized a path to strengthen its hold over neighboring nations. Yet every rifle gained was a promise of conflict to come. While the Mohawk opened trade with Fort Orange, the French-aligned Huron and Algonquin grew wary. The traditional balance of power, shaped by geography, diplomacy, and spiritual protocol, began to shift. Firearms did not just make hunting easier, they changed the terms of survival. Tribes without access to European weapons faced sudden vulnerability. As more beavers were trapped and fewer remained in Iroquois territory, the question sharpened. Should they trade deeper into enemy lands or take them by force? The answer soon would come in war. Across the St. Lawrence and Great Lakes regions, fur quickly became the central resource in European colonial ambition. The French couriers du bois pushed deeper into the interior, navigating rivers in birch-bark canoes, eager to bypass coastal tribes and reach fresh sources of beaver. At trading posts, iron tools, beads, blankets, and muskets were exchanged for pelts. But the real cost was unseen. French policy sought to control native alliances through Jesuit missions and selective trade. The Dutch, meanwhile, were transactional, offering guns without conversion or settlement. Native nations navigated both options strategically. The Huron and Algonquin deepened their ties with the French, relying on old patterns of alliance. The Iroquois, led by the Mohawk, maintained relations with the Dutch, prioritizing weapons over religion. This divergence created a dangerous imbalance. Dutch-supplied muskets gave the Iroquois superior firepower, while their central location allowed them to control key trade corridors. French-aligned tribes found themselves encircled, forced into increasingly fragile coalitions. What had begun as competitive trading soon bred calculated hostility. By the late 1620s, raids were no longer rare responses, they became strategies. Riverways turned to battlegrounds, and diplomacy gave way to ambush. The forest no longer echoed with only paddles, but with war cries. By the early 1630s, the first major fractures appeared. Reports from French traders and Jesuit priests told of villages destroyed, captives taken, and alliances collapsing under pressure. Huron scouts reported Mohawk war parties moving west, raiding supply lines and disrupting fur convoys. Erie sent messengers warning of Iroquois scouts in their forests. The Susquehannock braced for incursions. At the heart of the storm was a simple truth. Beaver populations were shrinking. Overhunting, driven by European demand, pushed trappers farther into contested zones. With fewer pelts available near home, the Iroquois began campaigns of expansion, not for land, but for access. Entire nations became targets. Warfare was not constant, but it was frequent and organized. Night raids, ambushes at portage points, and destruction of canoes became common tactics. Villages were burned not simply to defeat enemies, but to cut them off from trade routes. The French responded with increased fortifications and missionary expansion, but they could not match the speed or strategy of Iroquois movements. As the sun set over smouldering settlements, a new era began, one where trade and war were no longer separate. The forest was no longer a place of negotiation. It had become the battlefield itself. The year was 1609, and the forest near Lake Champlain held a stillness unfamiliar to both French and native alike. Samuel de Champlain, armed with a long arquebus, stood beside his Algonquin and Huron allies as mist rolled across the water. Ahead, a Mohawk war party advanced, silent, disciplined, and unaware that firearms would now decide battle. When Champlain fired, the weapon's flash shattered the air. 2 Mohawk leaders fell instantly, their armour of slatted wood no match for gunpowder. The rest scattered, stunned not just by the weapon, but by the noise, the smoke, the rupture of their reality. It was the first recorded battle in northeastern woodlands where European firearms were used against native people. Champlain's shot did more than win the skirmish. It marked the beginning of a transformation in native warfare, diplomacy and trade. The Iroquois Confederacy, stunned by this new power, would never forget the moment. In that single morning they understood that alliances now came with deadly technology. As the Mohawk retreated, the French and their native allies claimed victory. But the war had only begun. The Iroquois would not be deterred. They would adapt, reorganize, and eventually return with guns of their own. While Champlain marched with his Algonquin and Huron allies in the north, another power was rising in the south. The Dutch, having established trade through the Hudson River Valley, built Fort Nassau and later Fort Orange near present-day Albany. Their goal was profit, not conversion or settlement. They dealt directly with the Mohawk, supplying metal tools, cloth, and most importantly, muskets. For the Iroquois, especially the Mohawk, this trade was transformative. By the 1620s, they had regular access to firearms, while their French-aligned enemies were still limited to bows, lances, and older flint weapons. With every shipment from the Dutch, the Iroquois grew stronger. They began to rearm, retrain, and prepare for retribution. The Confederacy's Grand Council met to discuss long-term strategy. They would not rely on the French. They would not be outgunned again. From the heart of Iroquois territory, plans formed to strike deeper into Huron and Algonquin lands. These were not mere raids. These were coordinated campaigns meant to secure hunting grounds, trade routes, and respect. The Dutch, in turn, saw advantage in keeping the Iroquois powerful and dependent. A new balance had emerged, guns for furs, and a warpath paved by trade. The forest would soon echo with musket fire. In the years that followed the Champlain encounter, the Iroquois Confederacy adapted rapidly. Within council fires, war leaders and sachems debated tactics and survival. The Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca agreed that isolation would mean defeat. Unity became their strength, and Dutch weapons became their equalizer. Young warriors trained in flintlock use, while elders redirected diplomacy towards securing territory and influence. Their aim was not retaliation alone, it was control. Control over trade routes to the north and west, control over access to beaver populations, control over which tribes rose or fell. By the late 1620s, Iroquois war parties struck deep into Algonquin territory, targeting canoe lines, supply caches, and trapping grounds. Each raid was swift, calculated, and devastating. French outposts, reliant on alliance networks, scrambled to protect partners already weakened by disease and scattered defences. The Iroquois understood that power no longer rested solely in tradition or terrain. Now it moved with gunpowder. In villages once spared by custom, war belts were delivered with no ceremony. Peace had become a temporary state, broken when advantage dictated. What began as survival had shifted into strategy, and the Iroquois were no longer reacting. They were defining the course of the Beaver Wars. One of the most critical turning points came with the collapse of Huron defences in the early 1640s. French Jesuits had long established missions among the Huron, seeing them as vital allies and potential converts. But the protection they offered was limited. The Iroquois, now armed with Dutch muskets and experienced in forest warfare, launched a series of relentless campaigns into Huron territory. Villages were burned, food stores seized, and entire communities displaced. The French could not stop the advance. In 1648 and 1649, coordinated Iroquois attacks destroyed several key Huron settlements, including the major mission centre of Sainte-Marie among the Hurons. The survivors fled, some to French-controlled areas, others to join distant tribes. The Iroquois Confederacy, once a dominant power, effectively ceased to exist. For the Iroquois, this victory was more than military. It broke a centuries-old trade network and erased a cultural rival. The Dutch, observing from the south, continued to supply weapons and goods in exchange for pelts, but it was the Iroquois who now controlled the northern fur routes. The balance of power had shifted again. The French lost an ally, the Algonquin grew isolated, and the forest itself grew quieter, cleared not just of enemies, but of resistance. The French response was slow but deliberate. Realizing that traditional alliances were crumbling, they increased efforts to build stronger defensive lines. Mission settlements became fortified, surrounded by palisades and manned by both soldiers and converted native auxiliaries. At the same time, French leaders sought new tribal allies, groups threatened by Iroquois expansion, who still resisted the Dutch trade system. Despite these efforts, the French remained outmaneuvered. Their forces were small, dependent on river routes, and often delayed by internal disagreements. Jesuit priests continued their work among surviving tribes, but conversions offered no protection from musket fire. The Iroquois remained mobile, organised, and relentless. They attacked outposts, ambushed supply lines, and intercepted trade convoys. Their goal was not to defeat France. It was to destroy France's ability to trade. As summer campaigns gave way to winter planning, the war settled into a rhythm. Every season brought new losses, new targets, and fewer neutral villages. The Beaver Wars were no longer isolated conflicts. They had become a system, sustained by European demand and native resistance. From Quebec to the Mohawk Valley, no settlement rested without fear. Trade had become war, and the Iroquois had proven they were no longer defending, they were winning. By the 1630s, warfare across the northeast had evolved into a system. The Iroquois Confederacy, fully armed and increasingly coordinated, launched sustained campaigns beyond their ancestral lands. Beaver populations near Iroquois territory had dwindled from overhunting, forcing war parties to expand their reach. The goal was not permanent conquest, it was disruption. Raids targeted Huron, Petun, Erie, and Susquehannock villages with precision. Warriors attacked trap lines, burned canoe caches, and ambushed hunting parties. Each strike reduced enemy access to fur, driving survivors farther from French trade routes. Firearms gave Iroquois fighters a distinct edge. Muskets, once scarce, were now maintained with regular resupply from Dutch traders. War belts, once ceremonial, now signalled campaigns that lasted months. The French, slow to react, could not protect all allies. As a result, many smaller tribes began abandoning traditional lands in fear. The Iroquois Confederacy fortified its borders, and the neutral nation braced for impact. Across river valleys and wooded trails, the sound of gunfire replaced old war chants. The Iroquois no longer fought to defend, they fought to dominate. The beaver was still the prize, but now it was hunted through scorched fields and ruined granaries. Trade had become war, and war had no seasons. The Petun people, close allies of the Huron and known for their tobacco trade, were among the first to face the full force of Iroquois expansion. Their villages, located in the uplands south of Georgian Bay, had long avoided direct conflict. But as the Iroquois Confederacy weakened, the Petun found themselves exposed. In the early 1640s, Iroquois raiding parties crossed into Petun territory with fire and steel. Villages burned, storehouses were looted, and survivors scattered. French accounts describe trails littered with broken tools and half-buried caches of maize, evidence of people forced to flee mid-harvest. The Petun resisted where they could, forming defence rings with the remaining Huron, but the losses mounted quickly. With French support limited to outposts and Jesuit missions, the western Algonquian tribes found themselves fighting with bows against muskets. Disease had already weakened their numbers, and Iroquois tactics, targeting food supplies and transportation, cut deeper than battlefield wounds. By 1650, most Petun settlements were abandoned. Refugees moved westward, some merging with the Ottawa, others seeking French protection near Montreal. The Iroquois left behind no garrisons, only ruins. Their campaign was not about occupation, it was about erasure. One tribe at a time, the fur trade's geography was being rewritten by force. Further south, the Erie people prepared for what seemed inevitable. Known for their large fortified towns and stone tools, the Erie had avoided early involvement in the fur trade. But as Iroquois war bands pushed west, the Erie realized neutrality no longer offered protection. Around 1653, Erie scouts reported increased Mohawk and Seneca movement along inland trails. In response, defensive palisades were reinforced, and warriors patrolled outer fields in shifts. The Erie had numbers and strongholds, but lacked firearms. Their stone-pointed arrows and heavy clubs were no match for flintlocks in open battle. After a series of skirmishes and ambushes, the Iroquois launched a full-scale campaign. Dozens of Erie villages fell in less than 2 years. Survivors fled west, some seeking shelter among the Shawnee or Miami. French observers noted the disappearance of entire communities without a trace. The Erie, once a dominant regional force, effectively vanished from the historical record. Their defeat was strategic. The Iroquois now controlled major east-west trade corridors reaching into the Ohio Valley. Every tribe west of the Finger Lakes understood the message. Resistance without guns invited destruction. The Beaver Wars had become a series of calculated erasures, removing rivals from both the map and memory. The French, struggling to maintain influence, focused on building fortified missions and deeper alliances with displaced tribes. Jesuit priests expanded their presence across Upper Canada, offering shelter and spiritual guidance. These missions became centres of both resistance and retreat, sanctuaries for Huron, Petun, and Algonquin families driven from their homelands. But they were not immune. Iroquois raiders began targeting supply lines to these outposts. Priests were ambushed while travelling. Converts were taken as captives or killed. Sainte Marie among the Hurons, once a thriving mission complex, was set ablaze by its own defenders in 1649 to prevent its capture. French leaders appealed for reinforcements from Quebec, but few arrived. Colonial officials hesitated to commit full military support while trade profits declined. Meanwhile, the Iroquois strengthened their position through selective diplomacy. They offered peace to distant tribes, demanded tribute from weaker neighbours, and struck down those who refused both. No European power could match their reach. By the early 1650s, the Iroquois had restructured the northern fur trade on their own terms. French posts shrank into isolated enclaves, Dutch traders stayed close to Mohawk allies, and across the northern woodlands, the language of war had become more familiar than that of prayer. As the 1650s progressed, Iroquois operations moved farther from their core homelands. War parties now ranged deep into the Ohio Valley, raiding Shawnee and Miami settlements, while others struck north toward Ojibwe fishing camps. Their aim was not merely to weaken enemies, it was to monopolize trade routes across the entire interior. Every tribe brought under threat either submitted, fled, or was absorbed. The Iroquois took captives regularly, adopting some into their clans to replace war losses and sustain population. This strategy, known as the Morning War tradition, now merged with economic warfare. Captives became replacements, but also bargaining chips in diplomacy. These were not indiscriminate attacks. Each campaign targeted a rival nation's ability to trade with the French or English. The Beaver Wars had become geopolitical. By controlling river routes and trapping zones, the Iroquois inserted themselves as mandatory middlemen in every major exchange. Their presence was felt from Lake Ontario to the Mississippi tributaries. European maps began to reflect this influence, noting 5 nations' territories far beyond traditional boundaries. At night, Iroquois camps filled with war councils and preparation. There were no drawn borders, only zones of control, and with each passing season, those zones expanded through force and fire. In 1664, the Dutch stronghold of New Netherland fell to the English. Fort Orange became Albany, and trade routes once controlled by the Dutch were absorbed into the expanding English colony of New York. For the Iroquois, this shift in European power did not signal defeat. It offered a new opportunity. The Confederacy quickly adjusted. Diplomats engaged the new colonial officials, offering continued trade in furs in exchange for steady supplies of muskets, powder, and tools. The English, eager to weaken French influence, agreed. With Dutch traders replaced, English merchants moved into the Mohawk Valley, and the Iroquois maintained their role as middlemen. Across the St. Lawrence, the French recognized the growing threat. Governor Frontenac, reinstated in 1689, launched punitive expeditions deep into Iroquois country. French troops, alongside Algonquin and Huron allies, burned villages and crops in retaliation for decades of raids. The Iroquois, though wounded, did not collapse. Instead, they escalated raids on French settlements, destroying farms, capturing prisoners, and blockading supply lines. The war, once tribal and regional, had become entangled in imperial rivalry. Beaver pelts still moved, but now they passed through zones of constant violence. Neither side could claim full control. The frontier had turned into a border of fire. As English power grew in the northeast, colonial leaders recognized the value of Iroquois diplomacy. In 1677, the Covenant Chain Agreement was formalized between the Iroquois Confederacy and English officials in New York. The chain was symbolic, a representation of peace, trade, and mutual defense, but it held practical meaning. The Iroquois promised to keep peace among tribes allied with the English and support their interests in trade negotiations. In return, English governors agreed to recognize Iroquois autonomy and supply them with arms and goods. This alliance weakened France's position. French allied tribes found themselves under pressure not only from the Iroquois, but also from their former European partners. French colonial leaders attempted to rebuild influence by expanding mission networks and reinforcing their forts, but supply shortages and declining manpower made these efforts inconsistent. Meanwhile, the Iroquois played both powers. While trading with the English, they continued to negotiate with French emissaries, offering conditional peace, demanding tribute, or delaying talks while new campaigns were planned. The Confederacy's goal was simple: to preserve its independence and bargaining power. For a time, it worked. But as European wars spilled into the Americas, the Iroquois would find their position more precarious than ever before. The 1680s brought a rise in direct French military campaigns aimed at crippling Iroquois strength. These expeditions, led by French colonial governors such as Denonville and Frontenac, moved into Seneca and Mohawk territories, destroying crops, homes, and stored winter provisions. The goal was to starve the Confederacy into submission and break their dominance in the fur trade. Forts were burned, canoes were destroyed. In 1687, the French captured Iroquois leaders under the false promise of peace and sent them to serve as galley slaves in France. The betrayal deepened hostilities. The Iroquois responded with renewed raids, hitting French settlements in Lachine, Montreal, and surrounding parishes. French civilians lived in fear, while native allies grew resentful of France's inability to shield them from retaliation. These years saw a brutal cycle: French offensives by summer, Iroquois counterattacks by fall. Neither side gained lasting ground. French mission villages lay in ruins, and Iroquois fields were repeatedly burned before harvest. Both powers paid in blood, but neither yielded. In this deadlock, the beaver trade suffered, and many native families fled the contested zones entirely. The war had begun for control of fur. By now, it was about survival, and winter came early for all sides. Economic strain began to show on both sides of the conflict. Beaver populations were depleted across large swathes of territory, due to decades of overhunting. French traders in Montreal faced shortages, and export volumes to Europe declined sharply. Meanwhile, English traders complained that Iroquois pelts were fewer and of poorer quality. The fur economy that had driven alliances, wars, and diplomacy was collapsing under its own weight. Native communities, already weakened by disease and displacement, struggled to maintain hunting territories. Seasonal migration patterns broke down as warfare interrupted travel routes and poisoned relations among neighbouring tribes. As resources dwindled, the strategic value of native alliances shifted. Colonial powers no longer saw long-term trade as the sole objective. They wanted military loyalty. The Iroquois, sensing this change, hardened their bargaining position. They demanded exclusive trade rights and territory guarantees from both the English and French. Some factions within the Confederacy argued for peace, others called for renewed campaigns. The unity of the Five Nations began to strain under pressure. At the same time, France prepared for war in Europe against England, stretching its military focus thin. The struggle in the forests was no longer about controlling trade, it was about enduring the collapse of it. By the end of the 1690s, exhaustion set in across all fronts. Dozens of villages had been destroyed. Crops failed under pressure from scorched earth tactics. Refugees crowded into mission stations, straining food and medicine. Even seasoned Iroquois war leaders began calling for negotiations. At the same time, French and English officials both recognized the futility of continuing a war with limited economic return. Colonial governors exchanged letters proposing prisoner releases and neutral trading zones. In 1700, preliminary peace talks began at Onondaga, attended by representatives from New France, New York, and multiple native nations. The Iroquois Confederacy, still battered but politically intact, demanded that peace be inclusive, not just between empires, but among native nations as well. France, anxious to secure its Canadian holdings before another European war, agreed to formal negotiations. On August 4, 1701, the Great Peace of Montreal was signed by 39 First Nations and French officials. The Iroquois accepted peace without surrender, and French-aligned tribes agreed to end hostilities. For the first time in nearly a century, the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Valley stood quiet. But the memory of the Beaver Wars remained, etched into abandoned trails, broken alliances, and a map forever changed by fire and trade. In the summer of 1701, the banks of the St. Lawrence River saw an unprecedented gathering. From the Great Lakes, Hudson Bay, and the Ohio Valley, canoes arrived daily, carrying envoys, elders, and war leaders from dozens of nations. Some came bearing peace belts, others with scars from recent battles. By August, over 1,300 indigenous representatives had gathered in Montreal, joined by French colonial officials and interpreters. The goal was not simply to end hostilities, it was to construct a framework for coexistence. The Iroquois Confederacy, worn by years of war, agreed to cease fighting against French allies. In turn, France promised to recognize Iroquois neutrality in future imperial conflicts. Other tribes, Ojibwe, Odawa, Huron-Wendat, Miami, and more, signed peace terms that reaffirmed territorial respect and trade rights. No side claimed total victory, but all understood the necessity of peace. The Beaver Wars had exhausted resources, shattered populations, and destabilized the fur trade itself. Montreal's peace summit was not a single negotiation. It was a network of overlapping agreements, brokered over weeks of councils, speeches, and ritual exchanges. As dawn broke on August 4, 1701, signatures were finalized. For the first time in nearly a century, native and colonial powers declared peace, together and in writing. For the Iroquois Confederacy, the Great Peace did not signal defeat. It confirmed survival. Through nearly a century of war, they had maintained unity across 5 nations, adapted to European technologies, and negotiated from a position of strength. Though weakened by casualties and internal strain, the Confederacy remained a central power in northeastern diplomacy. Their acceptance of neutrality allowed them to avoid direct entanglement in the next round of Anglo-French wars. Within longhouses across Haudenosaunee territory, clan mothers and chiefs debated their next steps. The peace had preserved their influence, but only for now. The French retained key alliances. The English continued to expand westward. The beaver trade resumed, but never reached its earlier intensity. Overtrapping and environmental disruption had taken a permanent toll. New tribes emerged in the power vacuum left by those who had disappeared. The Petun were gone, the Erie were gone, Even the Susquehannock had fractured, but others, like the Anishinaabe and Shawnee, rose to fill the shifting map. While some villages rebuilt, others relocated entirely. The war had not redrawn boundaries, it had erased and rewritten them, and yet the Iroquois remained. Their story did not end with peace, it continued, shaped by endurance and the memory of fire. In the years following the treaty, trade resumed, but under new terms. French forts at Detroit and Michilimackinac expanded their reach, drawing tribes westward. The English tightened their grip on the Mohawk Valley, using new trade agreements to build fortified outposts. Native nations found themselves navigating an altered economic landscape. No longer could any one group monopolize the fur trade. Instead, regional alliances formed and fractured based on access to firearms, pelts, and safe travel routes. The Iroquois continued to act as intermediaries, but competition from emerging western tribes reduced their leverage. French traders courted distant groups in the Illinois country and the upper Mississippi, while English agents pushed beyond the Appalachians. The geography of exchange stretched wider, even as the volume of furs declined. Beavers had been nearly trapped out in some eastern regions, forcing longer journeys into unfamiliar territory. As a result, the fur trade lost its dominance in colonial policy. It remained important, but it no longer drove strategy as it had for nearly a century. The Beaver Wars had forged the foundations of empire and native resistance. Now those empires and nations would fight on new fronts, driven by land, religion, and political rivalry, not just by fur. The legacy of the Beaver Wars was not measured in victories, it was measured in what no longer remained. Dozens of tribes that once controlled their regions disappeared from maps. Languages were lost. Ceremonial routes and ancestral hunting grounds faded into overgrowth. Mission sites fell silent, overtaken by moss and vines. The wars did not simply end nations, they ended ways of life. Those who survived often did so by merging into larger alliances, altering traditions to fit new pressures. In many places, tribal boundaries blurred. The memory of the wars lived on in stories told around council fires, in wampum belts recording peace agreements, and in the caution passed from elder to child. The French would remain in Canada until 1763, the English would become the United States soon after, and native nations would face new waves of displacement. But long before those chapters began, the Beaver Wars had already transformed the continent. They shaped how tribes related to each other and to Europeans. They redrew economic and political borders before colonial powers ever claimed them. And though peace had come in 1701, its silence was temporary. What ended in Montreal would echo again, in different wars, under different names. At night, when the fires dimmed and the canoes rested along riverbanks, survivors of the Beaver Wars remembered what had changed. What had once been seasonal raids had become intergenerational conflict. A world shaped by trade, kinship, and ceremony had been overtaken by one shaped by muskets, politics, and diplomacy. Yet even in that transformation, native nations endured. The Iroquois Confederacy remained politically active, its structure still guided by the great law of peace. Former enemies, Huron, Ottawa, Mohican, and others, rebuilt in new regions, blending custom with adaptation. The treaties signed in 1701 would be cited for decades in later negotiations, invoked by native leaders defending land rights and sovereignty. The Beaver Wars had not been forgotten. They had become a reference point, a lesson, a warning. Though few outside academia remember the details today, their influence was lasting. For 92 years, fire, trade, and strategy reshaped the northeastern woodlands. In those years, nations fell, alliances hardened, and a continent was quietly altered before the American and Canadian borders ever existed. The 92-year war, as it might now be called, ended without parades or monuments, but its scars remain, etched into the rivers, forests, and memories that refuse to vanish. If you made it this far, thank you for spending your time here. If you'd like to hear more quiet history like this, consider subscribing. Your support truly means a lot.